Hey guys, welcome to Fast Keto. I'm your host, Ketogenic Girl. Hey guys, welcome to today's episode. I had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Shawn Baker today. He is the carnivore surgeon, and he was recently on a major podcast, Joe Rogan's podcast, and has been featured on a few others. And I wanted to have him on today to explore and talk about his experience with doing a carnivore diet. Now, I'm going to be doing a separate episode just with some of my thoughts on carnivore. I am personally still forming my opinion about carnivore and carnivore keto. That's why I'm doing a lot of episodes right now about carnivore, is because I find it very intriguing, especially some of the dramatic health benefits that certain individuals have been able to get from doing a carnivore diet. And I like to think of it as zero carb. You know, if you're doing keto, your carbs are already very, very low. Doing carnivore is really just taking it another notch to zero carb, as opposed to thinking of it primarily as an all meat diet. And I think it can potentially be an interesting tool to have as a part of a ketogenic lifestyle, to take things to zero carb once in a while, or just to change things up to try and have an elimination protocol to see how different foods you eat affect you. There's a lot that can be learned from doing carnivore on a temporary basis, but I'm still really forming opinions on it, and I'm really having a lot of discussions about it on the podcast, because I know every time I poll my audience on Instagram, everyone is really fascinated to learn more about it. And I think it's because of some of the remarkable health benefits that certain people have experienced. And it's really interesting to see how some people who've struggled with health issues that have been chronic, that they've been unable to heal in any other way. You know, like Dr. Baker says, you know, who wants to go on an all meat diet? Like, you really have to be at a point where you have exhausted all of your options and you want to try something new, or you're doing it just out of curiosity because you're a biohacker, you like to try different things. And it's how we learn, is really by trying different things ourselves. So I'm going to do a full episode soon when I formed more of an opinion on carnivore myself personally. But in the meantime, I love having guests on to talk about it, their experience with it, especially if they've been doing it for, say, over a year, and how they've been doing on it. If you're interested also, you can Google Dr. Shawn Baker's Bloodwork results, and he has some really interesting results on there. You can go and see some of the analysis and interpretation that Rob Wolf did on his website if you want to check that out. I'll put all of that in the show notes as well by next week. So here is today's episode featuring Dr. Shawn Baker. If you haven't checked out my cookbook yet, it's called Keto Essentials. It's available on Amazon, and it has 150 of my most favorite ketogenic recipes. It has tons of info on how to get into ketosis, how to analyze your results, and so much more. Check it out on Amazon under Keto Essentials, and be sure to leave me a review if you get a chance, or tag me in photos of any recipes that you make. I love getting to see those. A few disclaimers. By listening to this podcast, you agree not to use this podcast as medical advice, as I am not a qualified healthcare provider. The information presented on this podcast is for educational purposes only. Ketogenic Girl is not qualified to provide medical advice. Consult your own physician for any medical issues that you may be having. This entire disclaimer also applies to any guests or contributors to this podcast. Prior to beginning a ketogenic diet, you should undergo a full health screening with your physician to confirm that a keto diet is suitable for you, and to rule out any conditions or contraindications that may pose risks or that are incompatible with the ketogenic diet. A keto diet may or may not be appropriate for you if you have any kind of health condition, whether known to you or unknown. So you must consult your physician to find this out. Anyone under the age of 18 should consult with their physician and their parents or legal guardian. Welcome to today's episode, which is all about how to eat a carnivore diet from the carnivore surgeon himself, Dr. Shawn Baker. You may have heard of him, you may not have heard of him. He has recently been making a big name for himself in the carnivore space, and also bringing a ton of attention to the carnivorous diet. He was recently featured on the Joe Rogan podcast. I think it was maybe in January, and Joe Rogan and him did a deep dive on on his whole history as an orthopedic surgeon, being in the Air Force, all of his accomplishments as a surgeon, and then how he found Carnivore, how he sets and continues to set personal records and has won many competitions, strength building competitions. And he's done all of these records and continues to set new records as well, being a drug-free athlete, lifetime drug-free athlete. But he follows a carnivorous diet. And today we're going to talk all about how he found the carnivore diet. And I'm so excited to have Shawn joining us today. Welcome, Shawn.
Vanessa, hi, how are you?
I'm great. How are you doing? Where are you coming to us from today?
I am in Southern California right now.
Oh, awesome. Is that where you're situated most of the time?
Yeah, I spend about 80% of my time here.
Awesome. Well, you're pretty lucky. It's such a beautiful part of the world.
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely got nice weather, nice scenery. There's a little too many people here, but and too high taxes, but other than that, it's a nice place.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, I'm so glad that you could join me today to talk all about Carnivore. And I was just doing a little bit of an intro on you, but maybe you could tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself for anyone who may not have heard of you yet.
Yeah, I'm how old am I? I'm an old guy now. I'm a 51-year-old lifelong athlete who has a background. I was an orthopedic surgeon. I kind of just had my own kind of personal journey with health, like many of us do. As I got into my middle ages, I found that my health was declining, and so I experimented with a whole host of different diets, including ketogenic diets, paleo diets, low fat, high fiber, vegetarian-esque diets, and I went through the whole gamut, and eventually I wound up with basically a fully carnivorous diet, which for me personally has worked extremely well. And I was kind of public about it. And then subsequent to that, I just had a lot of people that had tried it, and we've kind of sort of seen it's kind of a wave, if you will, or of people doing this, many of them seemingly getting extremely good and interesting results, which has been very eye-opening with regard to challenging some of the traditional nutritional beliefs. And I think I'm just kind of continuing to pursue that. I think the most rewarding thing for me is seeing the outside of just the weight loss and body composition up, but the dramatic health transformations that I'm seeing with people with lifelong diseases that are getting better, which I think is really, I think that's just really interesting stuff, and it needs to be continued to be explored further, and hopefully I'm helping to do that.
Absolutely. Now, you're the second doctor that I've had on the show that follows a carnivorous diet, and the other one was Dr. Ken Berry. And when I first heard about carnivore, it was through some people in the ketogenic space and other authors like Ryan Lowry, who posted, I think he tried out carnivore keto, and other authors that I know who were testing it out for themselves. And I was like, these guys are crazy. Like, they've gone off the deep end. And, I was like, you really need to have vegetables. And I had maybe not standard American dogma, but I had like a keto dogma that I was looking at it from going, it's just insane to do this. So I decided to try it so that I could understand it better, because I thought it was so crazy. And it was through I did a 7-day trial of it myself, and I was measuring some things, not a ton of stuff, but my blood sugar and ketones. And I learned so much from doing it that I wanted to learn more and more about it. And what I'm finding is a lot of people who follow me in the ketogenic space are so intrigued as well. And I think it's just natural for there to, be so much interest when, it's such a fascinating thing. I was laughing listening to you on another podcast yesterday where you said, like, nobody wants to do an all meat diet. Like, it doesn't sound appealing. You really have to be like suffering or in pain, to want to take that step to try it out for yourself, or just really, really curious. So I'm just curious for yourself. You said you went, you wanted to improve your enhance your health. Is that for performance, or were you having health issues yourself that you're looking for different nutritional answers to?
Yeah, I mean, it was a little bit of both. I mean, I'm very competitive, and I want to, do what I can to perform well. And that was certainly a big driver. And I'd kind of read enough to think that it might be worth a try, and it worked out very well from this perspective. But yeah, there were still some lingering kind of minor health things, some joint pain, some skin things that you get as you get older. And I just had read about people improving beyond what they were doing on a ketogenic diet. And I said, well, why not just try it? There's no harm in trying it. And again, for me, fortunately, those things got better. So I had some lingering. I remember I had tendonitis in my right quadriceps. I'd had that for over a decade, and as an orthopedic surgeon, I deal with tendonitis all the time. time. And, I know all the tricks that we use to try to improve those things. And despite that, it just never went away. So I kind of resigned that, okay, you're older, you're just going to deal with it your whole life. And within, I think something like 6 weeks, it went away. And it was 10 years of tendonitis is completely resolved, and it's never come back in the near 19 months that I've been on this carnivorous diet. So I think there's something there. And, I know it's hard for some people to believe that, how is it possible that fruit or a vegetable could be somehow harmful for us, because we've sort of kind of swallowed this pill that, they're always good, they're always helpful, we should eat as many of them as possible. It used to be 5 servings a day. Now people are pushing for 10 servings a day. It's like we want to eat as much vegetation as we possibly can. And I think the reason that there is some benefit for that is it displaces, eating donuts. And I think that's as far as it goes, quite honestly. But yeah, so for me, it was both performance. I was already at a really high level of performance as an athlete. I was already kind of at this world record breaking level at what I was doing rowing at the time. And I basically dramatically improved on my performance, even though I was already at a world record standard. And so I think I had about an 8% increase in my power output, which at that level is very big. And, it's not like I'm new to weightlifting or training. I've been doing it for 40 years now. And so it's like, I got a huge boost in performance with that. And this is something I see echoed by people time and time again as I become kind of a central point for collecting stories and data on people trying this diet. I repeatedly see people saying, I'm getting stronger. It's, and I think there's something there. Again, all this stuff eventually will need to be formally tested. It's not like, we can just leave it at that, but I think it's compelling enough for people to try it.
I think there's a lot of interest in it, and I'm curious as to, from your perspective as a surgeon, as a doctor, and with all the training that you've had, why do you think that it works so well for the people that have had incredible results? And it's definitely not for everyone, as anyone would be able to gather. But for the people, there are some people who have done it, who've gotten extremely good results. So what's your theory behind that?
Well, I think like anything, and I think, it's from a medical perspective, there's no one that's going to deny that good nutrition is going to result in a better outcome, whether it's, post-surgical healing wounds or dealing with illness. I mean, I think that's common sense. And the problem is, we argue about what is good nutrition. In my view, and I look back to, from an evolutionary lens, I mean, humans have been eating meat for a long, long time. If we want to say that, and some people don't believe this, but, there's pretty good evidence that we evolved as humans about 3 million years ago. And we went through this progression as we kind of sort of branched off from a common ancestor that some of the other primates on Earth share. And we developed a more carnivorous path, and they stayed in this more herbivorous path, even though they still eat, chimpanzees and gorillas still eat, other animals. But, as we did that, we continued to take in more nutrition that way. Our anatomy, our digestive physiology adapted to accommodate that and accommodate the new dietary strategy. And it allowed us to evolve quite well, allowed us to have a bigger brain. With that, we became more proficient hunters as we learned how to utilize tools and weapons and range weapons and stuff like that. And so it's always been part of the human diet for, again, so long. Humans have literally become the best hunters on the planet. I mean, we have eaten literally, if there's an animal out there, you can bet a human has eaten it. I mean, they've eaten other human, I mean, it's like, you think about it, what other species has eaten whales and cows and birds and chickens and fish and sharks and ants and snails and frogs? We've eaten it all. There's no other species. There's no shark that's out there munching on cows. And there's no tigers out there munching on whales, but humans have done that. And the reason we've done that is because we knew instinctively, and that's how we conquered the world. We went from one place in the world, out of Africa, or if you believe Asia now, we went to every part of the globe. And the only reason we could do that is because our food source was always available. We went wherever there were animals were. There were no essential phytonutrients that we could find in both Africa and Antarctica and Brazil. And, it's just, if we were to say that you have to have some sort of plant material in your diet, and it's this, or certain combination of phytonutrients to survive, well, then humans could not do that. They could not move across the globe, because you're never going to find the same plant species growing all over the place. We would have been restricted to a small area like some of these other species that are highly dependent upon that. But if you depend on animals for your nutrition, you can go wherever the animals go. And we clearly and widely did that. And so I think that is, in my view, that is human nutrition. Now, people can eat other things, and certainly we have, and we're certainly omnivorous. If 50,000 years ago Twinkies and ice cream existed, you'd be damn sure humans would have eaten that stuff. Just because it's available doesn't mean we're supposed to eat it, we're designed to eat it, or it's optimal for us. You can look at the modern house cat. House cats, they eat a grain-based diet, and a lot, there's kibbles and all this garbage that they feed these cats. The cats eat them fine, and cats are obligate carnivores. We know that, but they can eat an omnivorous diet just like humans can. Problem with cats now is they're getting fat, they're getting diabetic, and they're getting the same disease that humans are getting. And so I would say, based on, at least what we can surmise from skeletal records from the anthropology stuff, we look at people that were hunter-gatherers pre-agriculture, circa 20,000 years ago versus the agricultural skeletons. The skeletons of the pre-agriculture people were stronger, thicker, they were taller, they were about 6 inches tall, their brains were bigger. Back when they were eating what was primarily a heavy meat-based diet, with some berries and nuts and starches occasionally thrown in, when needed. But I think the nutrition they were relying on was meat. And so I think, to make a long story short, I think that people are getting results because, number one, like any other diet that eliminates garbage, we're not supposed to be eating donuts, processed oils, processed sugars, processed grains, they're not part of the human diet in my view. They're not fit for human consumption. So when you eliminate that, no matter what your diet is, whether it's vegetarian, vegan, paleo, Mediterranean, you're going to get better with that. Now the question is, what's the best source of nutrition? I will argue all day long that meat is the most bioavailable nutrition you can get. It is free of, things that sort of interfere with absorption, like anti-nutrients, which are found in a lot of plant material. It's free of fiber, which I will argue is an unnecessary component of the human diet, and in many cases is harmful. And so I think the combination of eliminating the garbage and getting that really concentrated, really good nutrition. You think about it, what are the essential things we require? Essential amino acids, essential fats. There's a few vitamins and a few minerals that we're essentially required. None of that is required, means that you have to eat plants to do that. There's no plants that you have to eat. Many of the plant material has stuff in it we don't really need. We don't need oxalates. We don't need salicylates. We don't need phytates. We don't need glycoalkaloids and all these other things that can be problematic for people. And I think that's what we're seeing basically.
Well, you made a lot of good points there. And I remember when I took nutrition in university as my electives, one of the first things that we learned was the bioavailability of nutrients being so much greater in animal meat than vegetables. I was a vegetarian at the time, when I learned that, but I remember it was the first kind of building block of our studies that we learned is how high the bioavailability is there. I think as well what you're saying about how we've evolved and, how our brains did get larger, specific parts, I know, especially the frontal cortex, frontal lobe increased in size as we started to eat meat and all of those nutrients. So what I'm interested in, I guess, is what were the benefits that you saw? Because you were doing a ketogenic diet and then you went from ketogenic to carnivore. So you basically just cut out all plant foods and just eat mostly steak. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean that's essentially that's correct. I mean, when I was eating a ketogenic diet, I had a decent amount of animal food, but I was doing the quote unquote big ass salads, eating tons of spinach, I was eating berries, I was doing all the keto, the normal, and I wasn't eating keto junk food, and one of the problems with a ketogenic diet is you don't know what it means anymore because it could be all I'm eating is fat bombs and MCT oil and butter coffee and Quest bars. I mean, and some people will sit along and call that their diet. And I'm like, there's no way on earth that isn't a healthy, appropriate human diet, right? Because there's no, cavemen weren't sitting around eating, chugging MCT oil and eating Quest bars. It just wasn't happening. More likely they were eating, a big fatty piece of mammoth meat. But
right.
So, but I was generally, doing, eggs and meat and a little bit of fish and the salads. And I was doing, I think, a pretty solid version of ketogenic diet, because I just, and I would occasionally have the ketogenic desserts that everybody loves and the artificial sweeteners and so on and so forth. But, when I just went to the straight up, I'm just going to eat a bunch of steak approach, I just felt a little better. And the longer I did it, I just felt better and better. So the things that I noticed, for me, particularly over the long term were, again, when we touched upon this, I got stronger. Clearly, I got stronger. I got leaner. My mood got better. My sleep quality got better. The minor joint pain that I'd still had and the tendonitis went away. My skin, I'd still had some things that were associated with hyperinsulinemia. Those things got better. My libido got tremendously better, and again, people laugh about that sort of stuff, but it's a very important indicator of health. When you're in medicine, when people start talking about their libido returns, you're like, okay, you're getting healthy because that's
right.
a pretty good
testosterone is flowing well.
Well, clinical function is that's how you're supposed to be. And it's kind of funny because back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was the Seventh-day Adventists through guys like William Harvey Kellogg and his brother. Really, they didn't like people to have libido. They were like, "Well, it's sinful, it's evil, and we're going to cut the red meat out of the diet," because they knew that was causing. And they knew back then that red meat was something that enhanced that for both men and women. And so they made everybody eat grains and cereals in an attempt to stifle libido. And I would argue they've been pretty successful about it. And that's
right.
back historically. But yeah, so those are some of my benefits, and I continue. Even now, 19 months into this, I continue to see week to week, subtle improvements. Particularly as I'm very conscious of how I'm doing athletic performance. My athletic performance and strength continue to increase, and like I said, I'm in my early 50s, and that's not the normal pattern for people. Usually what you see is a slow decline, and I'm actually seeing continued improvement. And I don't know when that's going to end. I'm going to keep pushing until I top out at some point. Hopefully, it'll be when I'm 90, but we'll see.
Do you ever eat any plant foods at all, or you keep it like 100%? Like, do you adapt it in any way to yourself?
Yeah, I mean, my diet is, and again, this is not, some people say I don't do this to prove a point. I do it because I enjoy it.
Mm-hmm.
I eat, my diet. If you ask me, if you come to my house, 99 days out of 100, you're going to find me eating a ribeye steak. I mean, that's just what you're going to find. That's what I eat. Now, occasionally I'll throw, if I'm traveling, I go to a restaurant, I might throw a couple eggs in there because it gets expensive eating out if if all you want to eat is ribeye. Mm-hmm. So I'll throw some eggs in there. Occasionally I'll have a little seafood. Typically it'll be shrimp. Because I cook for the rest of my family, and they do a heavily carnivorous type. They're not fully carnivorous, and so if they're having something else like some shrimp, I'll cook it up, throw some shrimp and some butter, cook it up, and I'll eat some of that. Occasionally I'll have a little dairy, but generally I try to avoid dairy because it just, for me, it's been anything more than a small amount tends to be a negative for me. So I tend to avoid that. As far as plant stuff, sometimes there'll be some seasoning on the meat I have, particularly if I go out to eat, that'll be a thing. And sometimes it actually bothers me a little bit. I notice my digestion the next day, but I don't, I haven't had fruits. I haven't had vegetables. I've had like a glass of water. Somebody have a squirt of lemon in there. I'm not so like I'm going to die if something like that happens. But I don't really have a great desire to eat that stuff. It's kind of weird. One of the unique things that people talk about this diet is their cravings for this stuff just literally go away.
Yes.
And it becomes, and I think one of the reasons a lot of people, we eat for entertainment more than anything else in a lot of situations, or out of boredom or out of social pressure and stuff like that. And that's not nutrition. That's just, like I said, eating for entertainment. And so the fact that we now have, 5,000 different, not 5,000, maybe 100,000 different foods we can choose from. You can go to the grocery store and you can look at how many different varieties of food you could possibly eat. That is not normal in human evolution. I mean, you go back even 100 years and people probably had, 10 foods they would eat. You go back 500 years, they might have had 3 or 4 foods. Right. So, I mean, the human species and any other animal, my dog doesn't ask for a menu. I mean, he's not saying, "Hey, Dad, what's on the menu today?" It's like the same old slop you're getting every day, and they're happy and they're healthy. And right. I think when we put food in the terms of it's just nutrition, people ask me, "Don't you get tired of eating steak every day?" And I say, "Well, do you get tired of breathing the same old air every day?" I mean, it's like. We're not sitting there saying I got to have flavored air, I got to have different colored air. It's just a normal function of life. And it's a normal physiological process is eating like it is for any other species. And we just attach this variety, and sometimes we've outsmarted ourselves, and it ends up causing all sorts of neurotic behavior. We get people that obsessively calculate and track, and they're like, I got to calculate every micronutrient down to the nearest gram and or milligram, and it's perfect macro balancing, and to me that you just start losing the joy out of eating. I mean literally I literally love every meal I have. I mean, I've had nothing but great meals every single day. It's the same thing, but it's always good for me. I enjoy it. I'm very good at cooking steaks now, as you might imagine, and so I get a perfectly cooked steak every time that I know I'm going to like, and every time I walk away, every time I'm cooking it, I'm like, I can't wait to eat it, and every time I'm done, I think, wow, that was a great meal. And that's what my experience is with eating every day. And I don't think most people can say that with regard to their diet. It's right. Like, they spend so much time planning, and it's like, oh, that didn't turn out really well, or it didn't satisfy me. I need something else. And that's not what I get. I just get, satisfaction every time. And like I said, I choose to get my entertainment and my enjoyment out of life, my variety, I should say, in other fashions, whether it's doing things, participating with a family, living, experiencing life. And I don't make food the driver of my entertainment or something that my happiness depends upon, if that makes sense.
I'm curious if you'd ever, when I was talking to Dr. Kinberry, he kind of cycles in and out between keto and carnivore. Do you see yourself, I guess you're just more going by how you feel, your performance, and you're just going to stick to kind of strict zero carb carnivore for as long as you're enjoying it. Is that kind of the sense I get?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a philosophy anybody should take. If it works, it works. If it's not working, use something else. No, like I said, if sometime in the future, somebody, there's a piece of chocolate cake that I want and I eat it, I'm not gonna say, oh my God, there's, most likely what would happen is I'd feel crappy for a few hours or a day or two later. But, I'm not gonna say I'm never gonna eat anything else. I'm not gonna be dogmatic
Yes.
about it. It's not like I think, I'm not out there saying, I'm saving a tomato from being slaughtered. It's not, it's different from, it's not a religion. It's not an ethical belief. It's just what works for me well. And as long as it works for me and I'm happy, what's the big deal? But if I decide that, hey, I want to have a couple strawberries here and there, I may very well do that. Now I may decide that it's not worth it because I don't feel as good. I find out with dairy, when I sometimes indulge in dairy, sometimes like I'm going to eat some whole fat Greek yogurt and I'll have it and I'll eat it. And then I'll like, wow, it wasn't bad tasting, but I didn't sleep as well. My nose got congested, and so it's just a trade-off for me. And so it's like, do I want to feel good or do I want to satisfy some food urge that I rarely get? Quite honestly, it's not that much of an issue for me.
Right.
I sit there and there's in my house right now, there's fruit, there's vegetables, there's all kinds of things that I could easily eat. There's dark chocolate because I live with a bunch of other, more omnivorous people. And at any time I could eat that stuff if I wanted to. It's always around me, but I never really desire to do so just because, as long as I eat when I need to, then that stuff doesn't even appeal to me or even cross my mind. Now, if you said, for some reason you can't eat, you ran out of steaks and you don't have any gas to get to the grocery store and, you're really hungry, then I'm starting to think about, well, I got to eat something. And then that situation. But fortunately, I'm able to control the situation where, I have food when I need it.
I think the two most interesting things about carnivore to me are when I tried it for myself was the inflammation decrease that I had and also cravings went away. And I think I heard maybe Ted Naiman was talking about this, how a lot of cravings that people have come from a lack of protein and they're manifesting in different ways, like cravings for savory, like cheeses. It's because of the umami that, you get from eating meat. So I find it really interesting how the satisfaction, factor is there. And then you also have this decrease in cravings, which, are not ideal to be living, like having cravings all the time. It's just a distraction. But the other thing I find the most interesting and potentially beneficial for people is the inflammation. And I personally came to keto from having chronic inflammation, soreness, and pain in my hands and in my colon. And I was able to reduce it quite a bit with going gluten-free, but it seems like keto has helped with that. And I'm interested in learning more about, carnivore, using it as a tool, enjoying it. But also, I think that's probably one of the things that you see the most when you hear from people. You have like your N equals many website and Meat Heals. And I think the stories there probably revolve a lot around arthritic pain, inflammation that's caused by reduction of eating, all these carbohydrate foods. Is that like, what are the most common relief, sort of cases, situations that you see with people trying it?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And yes, you're right. There are a lot of chronic disease conditions that have an inflammatory component, and I think that extends obviously to things like arthritis and gastrointestinal inflammation, and there's some skin issues, and I think even some of the mental health disorders I think have a common cause in that, and some of that may be mediated through gut-mediated mechanisms. I don't know that we have a complete understanding of that, but I think there's something to that, and I think the food certainly does that. And so one of the most common reported things is is joint inflammation or tendon inflammation goes away. And again, digestive improvement is another very commonly reported, finding on people that switch to a carnivorous diet.
Sorry, I need to interrupt you there just on the digestion, because I think that's what people find the most shocking is the improvement in digestion, because that is the biggest question that I get or see by far is the whole fiber question. And, how can you survive without fiber, and how can you have improved digestion without fiber?
Yeah, and again, again, I think a lot of the stuff we've been taught from a nutritional standpoint is just based on some really shaky evidence. And I think the need for fiber is one of them. I think the RDA requirements, if you look at how those were derived, there's all kinds of holes and things we don't know. But, you think about it, there clearly have been societies that we know. We can point to Inuit, we can point to Maasai, we can point to Gauchos and Mongols and all these people that clearly lived on a very low fiber diet, a meat rich, very low fiber diet,
Mhm.
and they did fine. They weren't all sitting there bowled over with constipation.
Right.
I can tell you from doing it myself and all the thousands of other people who have done this for any significant time, we all have normal bowel movements. We all tend to do well with rare exception. And, and even animals, you look at animals in the wild that eat a carnivorous diet, they go to the bathroom. It's not like fiber is absolutely required. Now, some people say, well, they get a small bit of fiber from when they eat the stomach contents. But I think that's just, wishful thinking. I think, generally people that do that, just eat meat do just fine. And it's just something, we just have to, there's these things that we make these assumptions based on very little evidence, and no one ever challenges that. When you actually challenge that, you find out, wait a minute, those assumptions weren't necessarily right. Now, we've known, people will say, the people that are sort of anti-meat, or, a lot of times vegan propagandists will say, well, meat's sitting there rotting in your colon and all that stuff. That's clearly not the case. And we have very good scientific evidence to disprove that. We just look at some people that have had, colon surgery where they've had their colon removed.
Yes.
And you can see when they eat just meat, what comes out of their small intestine is very little. It's just a little bit of liquid. And so there's not like chunks of meat.
So it's mostly being utilized.
Yeah, it's being utilized. And so, like, again, and this is, I hate to talk about poop and stuff like that, but, I eat 4 or 5 pounds of meat a day on most days. And I have very small bowel movements, but I have them regularly. And it's just like, because all of that material that I'm ingesting is being utilized by my body, and it's very well absorbed. And it's not sitting there building up in my colon. If you take an x-ray, you'd see very little. The other thing is people will report much less bloating and gas and indigestion with this, because you're not sitting there with a big blob of indigestible fiber that the bacteria in the colon are fermenting and creating all this gas, which, leads to bloating and discomfort. And so, yeah, most people will say my digestion is the best it's ever been in my life. And so that's clearly what we're seeing.
Hey guys, just taking a really quick break to talk about the 28-day Ketogenic Girl Challenge. If you're interested in doing a ketogenic diet for yourself, it's a great place to start. I teach you everything about how to follow a keto diet to get yourself into nutritional ketosis, and it includes 28 days of meal plans. It comes with weekly shopping lists, how to interpret results, how to test yourself, a complete guide to getting started on keto. If you've been keto for a while and you're just not getting the results that you want to in terms of your health or fat loss, or you are brand new to keto, the 28-day challenge is a great option, because it also comes with my free coaching and support in our members Facebook group, and you can post any questions that you have about the meal plans, about keto, and I am there supporting you. We have an amazing community in our group. I like to call it the happiest place on earth, because everybody in there is so excited about following keto, about having found something that really works well for them. And everyone in there is just so kind, caring, generous, and supportive. And it's a really fun place to be and hang out. So if you'd like more info on it, you can find it at ketogenicgirl.com. And it's the 28-day Ketogenic Girl Challenge. And now back to our interview. I laughed so hard when I heard you talking to Joe Rogan, and you said, you don't get any awards at the end of the day for having more poops than anyone else. I mean, like, that's the truth, but we are obsessed, I think, nutritionally, with having lots and lots of fiber, and that if you don't eliminate or have a bowel movement every day, that there's something wrong. And it seems like the point of elimination is elimination of waste that the body doesn't need. But if you're eating a carnivorous diet, it's very logical to me that the body would be utilizing most of it and therefore have less waste, as opposed to just pushing through all of this stuff that the body literally can't use or digest or break down. It has to just push it through all the time.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back historically, and I think, and I read this when I was learning how to speak French, the phrase "ça va," which means "how's it going," used to talk about how are your bowels moving, and
Comment ça va? How's it going? Yeah.
Right. So it's how are your bowels moving, basically, and because it is true, if your bowels don't move, that is a problem. So if you're not having any bowel movement at all long term, that's clearly a problem. So the thought was, well, if my bowels are moving regularly, that's normal, that's good. The difference is how much is normal and how frequently do you have to do it? Do you have to have, like some of the vegan activists say 3 or 4 bowel movements a day? I'd say you're spending an inordinate amount of time in the bathroom. And if you're an animal out in the wild, you had to stop and poop every hour or two, you're probably going to get eaten. So it's not necessarily a good strategy. So I think as long as, and again, when there's a difference between transition to the diet, because during the transition period, people will have diarrhea, people will have less frequent bowel movements. But once you get into it for a few weeks or a few months, then you just have this complete normal regularity and your bowels run like clockwork. In fact, you don't even know. I mean, it's like you don't even feel digestion. It's like you can eat a big steak and go out and run, an hour later, and you're just like, wow, it's pretty interesting how that occurs, and people will commonly say that.
Why do you think that there is, I've read that before and heard that before, that there's this like intense energy? I mean, I guess it's right after you eaten sometimes, which it seems to me that meat would take longer to digest and be broken down for the amino acids and everything to be assimilated into the bloodstream.
Well, I think, there is definitely some truth to that. Certainly meat and fat, can take a longer time, and particularly if you're eating big meals, your gastrointestinal transit time will slow down to extract all those nutrients so you don't waste any of that. I don't know if I know the specific mechanism why somebody might feel energized from eating the steak. I don't know. There might be some chemicals going on in the brain, perhaps. I mean, there's a lot of gut-brain interactions that occur, and so sometimes there may be some nutrient sensing going on that says, hey, this is, I'm getting the right amount of protein and meat, and that's a good situation, and it just feels good. So I don't know. I'm not a GI physiologist with that, but I suspect there's something like that going on. But yeah, you're right. Your body will spend time, extracting that nutrition as it is, and it's not broken down as quickly as things like starches are. We have this quick reacting salivary amylase, pancreatic amylase, and that breaks down pretty quickly. But protein and fat, protein in particular, is a little more time intensive. And that's one of the reasons I think, particularly with protein, we're seeing that people, when they eat more protein, there's a bigger thermic effect of food. And so we're seeing people when they don't, when you add extra, a lot of people, when they talk about this calories in versus calories out, if they keep protein controlled, a lot of times the results are similar regardless of the fat or the carbohydrate content. I know it's controversial, but clearly people will recognize that protein in particular, changes the equation a little bit about, caloric intake and how much.
It takes a lot to break down. Yeah, a lot of energy to process.
It's more energy intense and more thermogenically intense. So it takes more calories to process the protein than it does some other food. So it's kind of interesting. But yeah, I mean, I don't clearly know the answer to your first question, no.
I think the other main question that people have with other than fiber is just nutrient deficiency, the potential for that. So what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think that's a legitimate concern. I think it's a very important thing to consider, and again, this goes back to, how do we determine what the right amount of nutrients are? And, if you look at, 2007, the Institute of Medicine did a review on, they had a conference to do a review on the dietary guidelines, or the RDAs, which are now called the dietary reference indices. And they concluded at that conference that basically all of the dietary reference indices, how much protein, how much calcium, how much potassium, so on and so forth, is based on merely expert opinion, which means they don't really have good randomized control trials to tell us how much we're supposed to need. So basically some guy just pulled it out of his butt and said, this is what you need to eat. I'm being a little facetious there, but that's exactly, and we have all this nutrition based upon these supposed guidelines. Now, when we look at how those guidelines were developed, again, they were looking at populations of people that ate high carbohydrate diets. Now, the things that I've come to discover is, carbohydrate metabolism has a different nutrient requirement than protein fat metabolism. So things like manganese or magnesium. If you eat a high carbohydrate diet, cofactors required to process carbohydrates require higher amounts of magnesium, higher amounts of manganese, and so on and so forth with all these other nutrients. And then the other thing is, we know that a lot of the foods, a lot of the plant foods where those vitamins and minerals are contained in, it makes it more difficult to extract. When we go back to this whole bioavailability and anti-nutrients where they prevent the absorption of that thing. So not only does eating a high carbohydrate diet drive up your requirements for nutrients, and I think that's why a lot of people have nutrient deficiencies, just because they're eating so much carbohydrate that it's driving the requirements up higher than they can meet. And the second thing is those
interesting.
Yeah, the second thing is those nutrients are harder to extract because you've got, it's tied up in, we know clearly that fiber will bind up mineral absorption. We clearly know things like phytic acid will prevent absorption of other minerals and things like that. We clearly, the thing with scurvy, that's a big one. Why don't you have scurvy? I have not had, I have not had a fruit or vegetable in 19 months. Why didn't I die of scurvy? And the answer is because, well, first of all, we know that meat has some vitamin C. It has enough vitamin C in that will prevent scurvy. And we've known that for 150 years now. The problem was we had this problem with the so-called limey British soldiers that, or sailors rather, that would develop scurvy on these long sea voyages. And the reason they did that is because they were eating dried and salted meats. So they weren't eating fresh meat, and they were eating a bunch of, bread. They basically had dried bread. Their diet was basically dried bread, which is high in carbohydrates, thus driving up the requirements for nutrition, particularly vitamin C. And they were eating dried meat, which had no vitamin C in it.
They were eating a lot of, is it pemmican, right? The kind of meat and fat in a can?
Not the sailors. Now, the pemmican came in. That was something that was developed by the Native Americans, the Canadian.
Oh, the explorers.
Yeah, so the explorers, the fur trappers and stuff like that, those guys survived on pemmican. And pemmican actually is fine. You can survive on that for a long time. And in fact, that pemmican, it's interesting.
Right.
Pemmican will last 10, 20 years. I mean, you can, it's so well preserved and so well made that you can leave it and eat it for years, and people have. And so, but that actually resulted in fine health. And I know there's some people that eat pemmican all the time and have done well with that. And that used to be some of the military rations. That people were eating pemmican and doing really well on that, and that's what the Native Americans obviously did for long periods of time, and that was their food. That's all they ate for the most part. There's probably some few other things, but they survived on that. So pemmican is different than salted dried meat, which loses some of those qualities. And I think maybe perhaps the higher fat content might help as well.
I mean, I think that's the visual that everyone has. And I remember being in school and you just learning about those sailors who had scurvy because they couldn't get access to any fresh vegetables. So I think that's probably the biggest fear that people have is probably getting, scurvy. And it sounds kind of funny, but, we're in this realm of uncharted territory, very similar to some of these explorers where we're questioning all this nutritional dogma, all this information. And I think it's important to talk about the potential for scurvy. And, I know that some people also who do carnivore supplement with organ meats. Like I've heard you say before that it's not like a major priority of yours, but I think that is something that some people on carnivore do just to supplement with more nutrients.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I think there's no problem with doing that. I think, obviously some of the organs, they'll concentrate nutrients. The liver is a very good source of things like vitamin A, vitamin C. It's, again, you have what your theories and your hypothesis, and then you have what actually happens in real life when you test it out. And I've really had basically almost as minimal organs as you can have. I had a little tiny taste here and there, just because somebody wanted me to try that. But I mean, I literally live on just regular old steaks. Or, I just interviewed a guy named Charles Washington yesterday. He's been doing it for 11 years. There's people that have done it for 20 years, just eating no organ meat at all. And they're thriving. They're doing just great. I do think there are some people that may have really significant nutrient deficiencies coming into that may benefit from more concentrated nutrition. There may be times of stress where those things may be of benefit. But I think in many cases, it's the same question. How much nutrition is enough? How much do we need to eat 10 multivitamins a day to make sure we get, super high amounts of vitamins and minerals? And I think there's some danger in that. And I think there is, this sort of thing
there's toxicity potential, right?
Right. There's toxicity potential, but there's a sufficient amount and then an optimal amount, and then there's just a waste of time amount, and I don't know where that line is, and I can tell you just based on how I perform, how I feel, and how I function, I don't feel that there's any problem with what I'm doing currently, and maybe I'll be proven wrong later, but all I can do is sit there and say, look, I'm performing at a level where I'm breaking world records. I don't know how much better nutrition you can get, if you want to use that as a metric for human health and human function. I think that's a pretty good measure in my view. But there are some people who disagree with that. They'll say being in shape, being muscular, being lean has nothing to do with health. And I'll say yes, it does. It has clear benefits. There's clear studies that show lean muscle mass is healthy as we age. Particularly, you need to preserve that. There's very good studies that showing that having good exercise capacity, good VO2 max is also very good for health. And so the debate goes on forever. You could sit there and take blood tests every single day for the rest of your life, and people would argue about the relative, merits or pros and cons of that stuff. And I'm just like, at some point it becomes crazy, and you just have to say, look,
yeah. I'm curious about your blood work. I think you maybe shared some of that on Rob Wolf's podcast.
Yeah, I talked about it on Rob's show. I kind of specifically did that because I wanted to kind of, what I had done and collect it in one place. And it was kind of controversial, and I'm completely fine with the blood work that I had. It's kind of interesting if you go through the whole thing. I had all my all my mineral, potassium, sodium, chloride, all that stuff. Calcium's all in normal range. My cholesterol was slightly, my total cholesterol was either one, I took it like 3 times. It was like 190, which was normal, or 205 at one of the higher ones, which is still like barely elevated. My LDL cholesterol is like 130 or 140, depending on which lab test I want to use, which is again elevated slightly. But if you look at my triglycerides, were 54.
Awesome.
My HDL was relatively low, but it's always been low. It actually went up quite a bit from where it was before. It used to be in like the high 20s, low 30s, really low. It went up into the mid 40s. And so again, my triglyceride HDL ratio was fine. Something called my LPA, little a, which is supposed to be a marker of disease, potentially. We don't know all the details on that, but if it's high, it's considered bad. Mine was about as low as possible. It was at 2, the high is considered 75. My iron studies were all normal. My testosterone was actually low, which was kind of interesting. A lot of people got sort of excited about that. And I'm like, it's so variable from day to day. My function is my testosterone clinical function is so good, looking at, anybody that's seen me or knows me and see what I can do strength-wise, body composition-wise. And I will just have to take my word for it.
Right.
Libido, sexual function for it, everything works fine, And so that people were saying, well, the testosterone level. I'm like, look, it changes day to day. There are a lot of things that go into that. I took it a week later, it was 100 points difference. And so the biggest thing I think that people were really concerned about was that my blood glucose was on the higher side, which is very interesting. And this is something that, but then the interesting point was my insulin was so low. And then when you calculated my, my insulin resistance scores, I was extremely insulin sensitive by several measures. You can look at something called a HOMA-IR score, where you take the glucose and the insulin and you multiply them and you divide by a number. There's a triglyceride like glucose index, and all those things said really insulin sensitive. My body composition says the same thing, but yet my fasting glucose was relatively high. Same thing with my hemoglobin A1C. And so some people were concerned about that. And then we started looking at, as we looked into the research, and I actually did a podcast with a guy which on my show, and we talked to this guy, and what he's seeing is in really high level athletes are seeing higher and higher glucose levels. And I think that is just a unique physiology that's developing with these athletes. And I've seen that as a trend with low carb athletes having slightly higher and higher glucose levels. And I think that's just a response to, what you're doing physiologically. And the same thing if you go back to, I'll go back to the Inuit population, because the last time people have studied, sort of meat eaters to any degree, particularly ones that eat a lot of meat. And those guys reportedly were eating something like between 4 and 8 pounds of meat a day, which is a lot of meat. And that's something what I do. And when they looked at that population, they found the same thing, that their fasting blood glucose tended to be in about the 120s. And yet they were free of any appreciable evidence of any cardiac disease or diabetes or anything like that. So I think it's, again, I went over this with Brett Shear, a low carb cardiologist, the other day, and we talked about the fact that glucose is a marker. It's not necessarily causative, but it is a marker for diabetic disease, and it's associated with that. But it's not always associated with it in all situations. We've got a neat population of people that have a glucokinase deficiency, and they typically run glucoses in the 130s, 140s pretty routinely. And they had a study where they followed these people for 48 years, and they found no evidence of increased rates of cardiac disease or renal disease, which is typically what you see with diabetes. So it has to do more with what happens to the blood glucose as it gets in the tissues, and specifically how it forms something called an advanced glycation end product, which requires the right environment and things like oxidative stress that promote that. And we know on a low carb diet, oxidative stress goes down significantly. We also know that meat has something in it called carnicin, and carnicin is one of the most potent inhibitors of the formation of advanced glycation end products. And so we're seeing that, these things are not happening. So for me, while it's an interesting finding, I think there's some interesting, physiology that goes behind that outside of diabetic pathophysiology. And so that's with the labs. Again, the one thing I like to say about labs, drawing blood and looking at it under the, under the microscope, or looking at it, in a lab test is such old technology now. We've been doing this stuff for 120 years. And unfortunately, one of the problems we're finding, Dave Feldman is showing us clear that those lab numbers can change so much on a day-to-day basis, on an hourly basis, that to take one lab test and say, wait a minute, this somehow predicts how your health is, to me is almost insanity. It's like waking up on January 1st, sticking your toe out the window and saying, what's the weather like? And then assuming the rest of the year is going to be that way. And, saying that, the temperature in July is going to be the same as it is in January, but it changes. It changes based on what you ate recently, how much exercise you had, how much sleep you had, what the temperature is, how much stress you're under. All these things can dramatically impact those things. And so to put so much stock in those things, one thing I always hear people, they're bragging about their ketone levels, or they're bragging about their HDL or the LDL or their triglycerides. I think, to me, that's just silliness. I mean, I think if you want to brag about something, brag about how much you deadlifted, brag about, what you can actually do, and not some random lab number that can change in a week. So, I mean, it's just, we have this And the keto community has a problem with this, in general. It's this hyper vigilance about measuring and calculating everything as if that is the answer to life. And again, I'll go back to the simplicity argument that, just enjoy life, enjoy your food, enjoy a steak, and just get on with your life and do what you enjoy, and don't sit there and try to constantly biohack and optimize, and it's just insanity in my view.
I think you're an optimizer, though. I think, like, from what I've heard your various interviews and the lifestyle that you do, you're someone who wants to get the most out of your experience of being here, and that's being an optimizer. And I think that's part of what brought you here. And so many people in the keto community do like all this biohacking and stuff because we're tend to be optimizers and want to get the best health possible. I agree with you that becoming neurotic about it is like a slippery slope, and it's important to not get too fixated on numbers and more focus on how you feel. One thing I know is that a lot of people in the space stay away from carnivore because they want to keep their blood glucose, fasted blood glucose, lower, and definitely if you're having higher ketones, most people who do keto are kind of in that 90 and below space being in ketosis. When I did my carnivore experiment, my blood glucose did go up over 100, 110 on the days that I spiked protein higher. And it was quite a bit of protein for me. But I think that you still can do a version. I like doing a version of carnivore keto where, you're getting tons and tons of nutrient dense meat in there, but you're not you're still operating within a range, for myself personally, where I like to see my blood glucose be. I'm not really worried about ketone numbers as much, because I'm not doing it for therapeutic reasons, but I like to see, what I think is optimal fasted blood glucose for myself. And I wouldn't want people to not try carnivore potentially, for a day or two or a week just to see it for themselves if they're having inflammation issues or things because they're afraid of eating too much protein and having those, higher blood glucose numbers. And like you said, there's also an adaptation period, that over time, those numbers might come down a bit. So there's no reason to fear it. But one question I do have for you is, are there any major contraindications that you see where, if someone was consulting with you about trying carnivore, where you would say you definitely, shouldn't try this or do it, or, something that kind of comes to mind as just not ideal for this kind of lifestyle?
I don't think there's any absolute contraindications. There are certain situations where people will struggle, certainly. And I think that, obviously you have to be, 'cause I get a lot of international folks that contact me, and some people, they're just the country they live in. It makes it prohibitively difficult, and so it becomes a challenge, And I think that's just a challenge in general we have throughout the world. Most people that are in these countries where they have little access to nutrition, animal nutrition is prized, and it's difficult to come to. But, let's just say we're talking about a standard American person that has access to all the meat they could ever want, which is which believe me, is a total luxury. And I'm very thankful that we have that. And we need to thank the people that provide us that food. But I think, there are certainly some people that have, digestive problems where it becomes difficult to digest meat sometimes. And I think that's a chronic illness. I think if you lose the capacity to well digest meat, that is an indication of poor health. And I think it's an indication of poor gastrointestinal health. And I think we see people that are chronically on hydrochloric acid suppressive drugs like proton pump inhibitors. We see people that have, diabetes or prediabetes where they get things like gastroparesis, where their stomach doesn't work correctly, it delays slowing emptying times. We have people where they have gallbladder issues where they can't, produce bile. Well, they can still produce it from the liver, but they don't secrete it in a bolus fashion like the gallbladder is supposed to. They have issues where maybe some of their enzyme levels, like the lipases and some of the proteases, have decreased over time because they're just not used to doing that. And so in those cases, it may take time. And in some cases, particularly older people, this is one of the problems we see with aging people, is they lose the capacity to digest and absorb good nutrition, which is things like meat. And so what happens is, as they lose that capacity, they can't take in as much protein. And so what happens to them? Well, they get the protein from wherever they can get it from, and that tends to be from their own tissue. They start to auto cannibalize their own muscle mass, their bone, the protein in their bones, the organs and stuff like that, and they become sarcopenic, frail, and weak. And then they eventually, they kind of shuffle along and lose the vitality for life, and then they die. But I can't think of a situation where there's an absolute contraindication to eating meat unless there's like some genetic abnormality where you have some protein, metabolism issues where certain proteins, that could be an issue. But for the most population, I don't think there's an issue. There's some concern about blood type diets. I will just tell you, I think the blood type diet is just silliness, particularly when it comes to regarding meat. And somebody asked me a blood type for eating meat, and I said, yeah, as long as your blood is red, you got the right blood type for it. But, I've looked at thousands of people, and I've actually asked them, what is your blood type? And just as many say, I'm type A as O. And, A is supposed to be this vegetable thing, and O is supposed to be the meat eaters, or so on and so forth. But clearly, that doesn't hold up, at least when it comes to eating meat. And so
Yeah.
I don't want to totally dismiss that, but I think when we're asking about can you eat meat, I think all human beings can eat meat, and we're all designed for that. Some people, if they're sick, they may have a harder time with it.
Well, on the flip side of that, whom do you think could benefit the most from maybe trying zero carb or carnivorous diet?
Well, certainly if what you tried before hasn't worked, that's just a no-brainer. I think if you're still having health issues in particular, I think, and honestly, I think there's a lot of people in the athletic sphere that are doing this, that are finding improvements in that. I think the carnivorous diet or the zero carb diet, as I sort of promote it, just eat meat, enjoy it, don't track stuff. That's going to work for the general population, I think, generally pretty well. If you get into this physique competitor, I've got to be shredded, I've got to be 6% body fat, then I think you have to do things outside of the normal norm. And that may involve, cycling things. It may involve restricting calories, restricting fat. Those things it's just not a natural human place to be in a lot of cases. There's no indigenous tribes walking around ready to walk on a bodybuilding stage. They're just not walking around with 6% body fat or entering some bikini contest.
Yeah.
It's just not what normal human physiology or, anthropomorphic measurements are supposed to be. Conversely, you're not supposed to be walking around at, 40% body fat either. So I think there's a happy medium.
Right. They're both extremes.
Right. So they're extremes. We're supposed to be somewhere in the middle. I would argue for most men, 10, 15% body fat's probably a normal place. Women, you probably want to add about 8% body fat to that range, something like that. But I think for most people, those are the people that are going to benefit. I think if you have any unresolved health issues, particularly chronic disease, even arthritis or something like that, it's worth at least exploring, because in my view, nutrition is the biggest environmental impact that we have on chronic disease. And chronic disease is so ubiquitous. So many people have it. It stands to reason that the more people that try that, the more people are going to be helped.
Do you think there's an optimal diet out there? Would it be something kind of in the low carb, ketogenic, carnivore space, or is it really just different for everyone?
Yeah, I do think so. I think there is, I think we're all the same species. It's not like you're out there telling zebras, it's not like, they're not like zebras with 41 stripes that have to eat this food and zebras with 42 stripes that have to eat a different food. It's basically the same animal diet. And I will continue to say this. I think a heavily carnivorous diet, maybe not totally carnivorous, I think is a very good nutritional strategy for most people. Now, certainly can people do well on other types of diets? Certainly they can, and they do. Again, if you're doing your best, and I've seen this time and time again, people that were, on plant-based diets or vegan or vegetarian diets that said they were doing reasonably well, but then they added, meat in their diet, and they just got better. And so I think, certainly you can do very well on a diet that is not necessarily optimal or ideal, and you can supplement and you can make that work. But I do think that animal nutrition is essential for human health and human optimization, whether it's 100% steak like I do, or, maybe you eat most of your nutrition. I think if you understand that my human food is meat, and I'm going to eat plenty of that until I'm full. And then if I can tolerate, having a few berries here and there, if I can tolerate some nuts or some broccoli or whatever floats your boat, then that's completely fine. I think that's a pretty good diet. That's what I think. And I think that, like I said, there's a lot of people that want to say everyone's a special snowflake and we have so much genetic differences. I'm saying, we're all about 99.99% the same genetically. That's just the bottom line on that stuff. There's slight differences. And some people can tolerate a little more dairy, some people can tolerate a little more grain, some people can tolerate a little more, this or that. But in general, I think human nutrition is, a big fatty mammoth meat. That's probably what human nutrition was meant to be. And the closest we can get to that right now is a big fatty ribeye. And I think that's in my view. And again, that's controversial. A lot of people disagree with that, but that's what I tend to conclude.
Most of the audience that listens to this podcast and follow me tend to be women. Do you have a prescription sort of for how much exercise at minimum women should be getting? Because I know that you do focus a lot on exercise as well.
Well, first of all, I think exercise is a wonderful thing. I think everyone should do it. And I'd like to speak specifically to the unique things about women, if that's okay with you. But just from a standard exercise standpoint, we have and I feel sorry for women in some cases, because we have this sort of social pressure to be size 2, stick figure, super skinny, eat salad, and there's this perception of what is considered worthy as a woman. A lot of that pressure is based on looks, and there's so much out there, and that's very unfortunate. And so a lot of women are, and they a lot of them, they do it upon themselves. There's this competition mode to be who can be the skinniest, who can fit in the size 2 dresses, and so I think that unfortunately has really hampered women in a lot of ways. And I think that in my view, a woman that is healthy, and you can argue aesthetics versus health, is a woman that has at least some muscle on her. And I think muscle is very healthy. And I think, doing some resistance training is essential for women. I think, getting in there, and again, not everybody can do this. Not everybody's going to want to do this, but I think, the basics of exercise, the squats, the deadlifts, things like that, which are going to, strengthen the lower back, strengthen the gluteal muscle, strengthen the legs is very, very important. I think kettlebell swings are great. I think that, not being afraid to be strong is very empowering, because there's so many, a lot of women are out there, they just feel that, muscle is for men and women have to be these dainty, delicate flowers. And I think women are robust, strong, just as strong as men. And if you look at it, and we've got some excellent example of women. If a woman's cross-sectional muscle area is the same size as a man, they're about the same strength. There's no real difference in that. It's just a matter of, women muscle works just as well, as just as strong as male muscle. It's just that women, obviously for hormonal reasons, don't put on as much muscle generally, unless they're taking drugs, which I think is generally silly. But so I think, I think women should, just like men, they should engage in some kind of strength training. They should have decent cardiovascular fitness, whether it's, aerobics or, HIIT style training. Those things are important. But, in general, this is the one thing, and I had Amber O'Hearn, who's another, you might have her on the show.
She's coming up in a few weeks.
Yeah, we had this discussion about her, and she talked about, women really, from a nutritional standpoint, it's arguable that they need more nutrition, more nutrient dense, more denser nutrition than men do, even because, women, one of their jobs is to have another baby, have a baby and sustain this life. And so they need higher nutrient levels to, that's one of the reasons women, they tend to carry a little more body fat. It's just because they have this sort of thing for fertility, for able to create another life and sustain another life. And then of course, afterwards, nurse the baby through breastfeeding. And so I think that, exercise is great. As we talked about, nutrition is paramount, probably more so for women. And this is an interesting thing with the carnivore thing, because one of the things, with some of the unique things that women struggle with, things like polycystic ovarian syndrome, things like infertility, things like amenorrhea or dysmenorrhea, or as they get older, some of the perimenopausal type things that go on as they approach menopause age. Those things are all getting better on a carnivorous diet. I've seen women that have been completely infertile reverse that within a few weeks or a few months and then become pregnant. I've seen women with polycystic ovarian syndrome reverse that condition, which is probably an insulin issue, most likely. I've seen women with bad premenarchal PMS, premenstrual syndrome, that their symptoms got so much better. Their periods became so much more comfortable. They didn't have the horrible breast pain and the bloating and the discomfort. Those things got better. Their cycle got regular.
Mood consistency, I think, has been a big one I've seen. Right,
of course, and the mood that goes with that. And so they just find that they're more at peace. They feel better. And again, those are issues that are unique to women. But those things have all seemed to have gotten better by pursuing. And a lot of cases, the ketogenic diet helps with that too, but particularly with a carnivorous diet, I think as women find that they're just getting better nutrition. I think there's so much to be said about getting this really good nutrition. Again, I'll keep saying, in my view, a fatty cut of meat is outstanding nutrition. And when you get that regularly, good things happen, to both sexes, but women in particular, their mood's better. The unique women physiology things around, pregnancy, fertility, menstrual cycles, menopause, all seem to get better.
I really love the way that you put that, because I think that when people first hear about carnivore, they just think about removing vegetables. It's the removal of all these things. But I think the way you think of it is more, you're adding more nutrient dense foods. And I think that's a really great way to look at it. So you've had some really exciting things going on lately. Where can people follow more about what you're doing? What are you the most excited about right now?
So I've got a book on the carnivore diet that's in progress, so that'll be out in the near future. I really enjoyed the Meat Heals stuff. That's been fun. Meatheals.com, where it's collecting the data.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to probably ramp up some more of these n=, minis type stuff in the near future as we get better at synthesizing and collecting data and learning from the initial experiences where, it's just not something that's easily done. My Instagram is pretty busy. Shawn Baker 1967. Twitter, I'm SBakerMD. I'm pretty active on that. I've got a website where I just do a little bit of writing and I've collected some stuff. I've done a little bit of individual consulting with people, and you can access that through shawn-baker.com. That's a website I started. There's some. I'm in talks with some people about doing some interesting stuff down the road where we can kind of try to change the whole medical system. We've got this system where, unfortunately, we're failing as a society and as a medical healthcare system to get people healthy. I mean, we're spending so much resource and time and technology on treating disease after it's already occurred, and we're not doing much to prevent disease. And I think the ultimate answer is not to have so many sick people, rather than how can we pay for all these sick people. We got to figure out how to not have so many sick people. And so there's some entrepreneurs that approach me about perhaps doing something in that space. So that would be something that hopefully I can be a part of. It's just, seeing this community grow and watching people challenge some of the, because it goes beyond nutrition, and I think it goes to just health in general and some of the very basic tenets of what we believe about a lot of things. One of the things about doing this carnivorous thing is you get so far out from the mainstream that you start to look back and say, wait a minute, maybe these other things aren't exactly as they've been advertised as well. And so I've got my own podcast, Human Performance Outliers podcast. We're having fun with that. Zach Bitter, who is a world record holding athlete, and I have kind of teamed up, and we're getting some good people on there. So that's also been fun. So lots of different things, lots of irons in the fire, and I'll continue doing that stuff. So that's what's going on right now.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Baker. It was awesome having you here, and we'll be sure to follow. And the podcast is really great. I've been listening. I listened to a few episodes that you had with Michaela Peterson, and it's a great format with the two of you. So yeah, people can follow more of your latest interviews and things that you're doing on there. It'd be awesome. Yeah,
I've got one today with Dr. Gary Fetke from Australia. So yeah, we're doing lots of them. So,
anyway. That's really exciting. Fantastic. Great. Well, thank you so much for being here today.
My pleasure.
Thank you guys so much for tuning in today. I had so much fun talking with Dr. Baker, and he is just a wealth of knowledge when it comes to carnivore, and the fact that he is a surgeon turned carnivore is endlessly fascinating to me. He had so much great information to share. If you're interested in learning more about carnivore, he's definitely the guy to follow in that space. And, I find it very, very interesting, just to have carnivore keto potentially as a tool in your tool belt for doing zero carb days potentially, or just trying it out for yourself. I did a 7-day experiment and I learned a lot from it. And I think that there's just a lot to be learned in trying different things for ourselves without, ruling them out necessarily. But having been a vegetarian for so many years and being a vegan, it only really makes sense that I go to the other extreme, which is trying carnivore. And I have to say, I have found it very interesting just to see the impact on my body. And I like to do my own kind of version of, carnivore keto, which keeps my protein within my protein range for myself. I like to see a certain level of fasted blood glucose in the morning. So, I'm not sure if I did carnivore for longer term, maybe my blood glucose eventually would come down. But for myself, when I did spike the protein higher, it did go into the 100, 110 range. And call me neurotic or not, that is, technically pre-diabetes for some people and for the general ranges. So I feel a lot better myself. I don't know if it's just mental, but being 90 and below and having, nutritional ketosis and therapeutic levels of ketones, because I also want the therapeutic anti-inflammatory effects of ketones and the mental acuity and sharpness that I get from it. So I think there's so much to learn from this carnivore diet, and it's great to get to speak with people who've tried it out for themselves. And I'm going to have a couple of other guests on who are going to talk about their experience with carnivore too, because I think we all find it super, super interesting and fascinating. And we'll be sure to balance out the episodes as well with just talking about straight keto and not necessarily anything carnivore too. But I hope you enjoyed that program. If you want more information, I'll put links to some of Shawn's websites and his podcast in the show notes. If you're interested in in trying the Ketogenic Girl Challenge, send me any of your questions on Facebook at the Ketogenic Girl, and you can send me any questions whatsoever about the 28-day Ketogenic Girl Challenge. All of the information is at ketogenicgirl.com, including the extension packs that I have that are the Build Your Day, Customize Your Day plans, and I'm about to release some new plans which are also extensions to the 28-day challenge. So you can find all of that information at ketogenicgirl.com. Until next week, I hope you have a fat-fueled weekend and catch you later.